Apologies for the video quality, but too many people are using the internet in my house, and so I cannot transfer files easily from my phone to my computer to edit. So I'm going to try this for this video because it's faster. It's my webcam. So we've already been talking about stop motion animation. We talked about it weeks and weeks ago. It's one of the earliest forms of animation, right? You stop the frame, you change something, you stop the frame, you change something. Oh wait, I can do that right now. That failed attempt to do stop motion animation with toys leads me to another thing that I want to talk about, and that is the relationship that stop motion animation has always had with this desire to bring toys to life. We talked about this way back when. We talked about the Nutcracker. We went into a whole tangent about E.T.A. Hoffman, and that was great. And that's going to be entirely relevant to what we're talking about here. I'm going to go way back again to 1908 and talk really quickly about one animator that we skipped. And that is Arthur Melbourne Cooper, who made Dreams of Toyland in 1908. He made a lot of other films too, but in this one he's using stop motion animation to move puppets, to bring toys to life. This is discussed on page 46 of your book. And I want to talk about this real quick because it factors into the stuff we're watching today. And I want to talk... Remember, we talked about this a while back. Toys come to life as a recurrent scenario, and we can think, why might that be? For one thing, there's a strong European literary tradition of stories about living toys. Toys are around, like you just saw, they make good actors, and children talk to them. That's creepy. I can personally attest to the fact that this is true. And children invest huge amounts of emotional energy in them. You can think about, where does that energy go, right? So we'll see later on that Jan Svankmajer believes that neither children nor objects are entirely innocent, and that objects can have a kind of concealed memory. Animation allows us to imagine and get at the secret life of objects. We also already talked about Ladislav Starovich a couple weeks ago, but he figures strongly in this tradition as well. Later on in his career, after he made all those awesome bug movies, he made a movie called Tale of the Fox in 1938, and he made a film called The Mascot in 1934. Both of these are films in which toys and animal puppets act out animated stories. Okay, so there's another piece of context that I want to give you for Jan Svankmajer, and that is location and politics based. So we're going to be talking here about the Czech Republic, the former Czechoslovakia, in which the folk art of puppetry is huge. And that folk art is going to translate politically into the animation industry. So we already talked in the last section about Eastern Europe and some of the political constraints that are happening. Czechoslovakia has a distinguished cinematic tradition before World War II. Commercial production starts in Prague in 1908, and it's a big film capital before World War I. By the early 30s, Prague had the most sophisticated production facilities in Europe. But during the occupation, domestic production is plummeting as the Nazis appropriated the studios and made German-language films there. But after the Nazis left, the Czech president signed a nationalization decree that established a new production system with a specially equipped studio for the production of puppet and animation films. And there's a state film school as well. Now, a lot of the films made in the 50s are going to be socialist realism, like we talked about, but when Stalin died in 1953, there began these kind of periods of thaw and freeze, moments of creativity and repression. We see this all over Eastern Europe, this cycle of freeze and thaw, these periods of tight control, and then repression is lifted by moments of liberalization, and then that liberality is perceived as threatening the stability, and government enforces new restraints. That's definitely happening in the former Czechoslovakia. Between 1962 and 66, the country takes steps towards reform. There's this period of cultural renewal. And we actually see the Czech New Wave. This is live action cinema, but it's really important. It's active from about 1963 to 1967. And if you are interested in this, there's lots more to say about this as well. And Jan Svankmajer is going to be a part of this. But by 1968, we start to see a crackdown, right? But by 1968, we start to see a crackdown, the third point in that cycle of freeze and thaw, and a move towards centralized control of the film industry. So the film I want you to watch, Jirí Trnka's Hand, made its way around the censors by basically lying about its metaphors. It's really going to be talking about artistic expression under constraints, but you tell me what you think it's about. Pay attention to the expressiveness of the puppet through gestures, through lighting, through camera movement, through editing. And what is it saying about the artist and about ideology and the expression of ideas in a totalitarian state? So again, I'm only going to show you a couple of minutes of this, but I'm going to give you a link to it in the description. I would really like you to watch the whole thing. I mean, why does this guy want to make flower pots, right? If not for this idea that art sustains life. It is the reason that we get up in the morning. What does it mean that the hand appropriates art, takes the flower pot at the end? And think too about the puppet itself. I mean, how is the puppet so expressive? Because it is, right? But how? What are the specific techniques being used to create those expressions on that puppet? I mean, arguably here we're talking about expression through movement, but see if you can pinpoint exactly what makes you understand what the puppet is thinking and feeling. Okay, now that you've got a handle on Czech puppet animation in terms of Jirí Trnka, let's talk a little bit more about Jan Svankmajer. Don't let his friendly Santa Claus appearance deceive you. What you're in for is a wild ride. I should say that he was involved in avant-garde theater in the 1960s, and in 1970 he joined a Czech surrealist group. And just as a quick recap of surrealism, what we're looking for is the uncommon use of ordinary objects, the externalization of the subconscious, the idea that logic is irrational. The surrealists are all about dreaming and expressing dream states, and nothing has to make sense. That's important. So what you're going to see in Svankmajer is strange, bizarre, but beautiful juxtapositions, fantasies associated with childhood. But importantly, Svankmajer believes that neither children nor objects are entirely innocent. I mean, look at the cover of this DVD. This cover should tell you everything that you need to know. So we talked earlier about the fine line between animation and horror, and this film is definitely going to speak to that. Now, the theorist Linda Williams talks about what she calls body genres, types of films that produce bodily reactions in the viewer. Horror is one of these. Horror has the ability to make us recoil, to make us even like a little bit, and I think that you might have that experience. Please watch this with somebody, by the way, if you can at all. make that happen. But you know, it can touch us in a way that few other genres of films can. So horror films are about the fear of the dark, the fear of unknowns. You know, they're reminders of the fragility of our own human bodies as well. So we see bodily fluids like penetrations, death and decay, and it produces this kind of physical reaction in us. And horror is also obviously related to the idea of the uncanny, you know, making the familiar strange. And we've been talking about this throughout the class as well. You know, animation has this ability to take something that is comforting to us or familiar to us and to make it strange in a way, like toys especially, make them wrong somehow. And so we're also talking here about the return of the repressed, the wishes that we have in childhood that our toys would come to life, that our toys would play with us, that emotional energy that we put into those toys will somehow be reciprocated. But by the time we're adults, we know that that's insane, that's disturbing, that's horror. We don't want that. We don't want our toys coming to life. So those fantasies turn into nightmares by the time we're adults. And that kind of fine line between the fantasy and the nightmare is something that's going to be explored in this film. So other things that I wanted you to pay attention to in this movie, I want you to pay attention to the use of sound, diegetic versus non-diegetic sound. I want you to pay attention to the distortion of sound. And I want you to pay attention to the relationship between sound and the representation of time, and the relationship between sound and the uncanny. How can sound render something that's familiar now unfamiliar, disturbing, just through sound alone? Also, given what we talked about with the Alice in Wonderland trope, what does Alice's imaginary world look like here? What are the elements of the mise-en-scène? How are we taking space and transforming it in a kind of interesting way? What are the symbolic values of the objects that comprise the mise-en-scène? I mean, do we see here the use of familiar materials in unfamiliar ways? I mean, we all know that a filmmaker can construct an entirely imaginary space, you know, one that never existed in the first place. But how is Svankmajer playing with that idea here, playing with the idea of the construction of imaginary space? Does this film play with our expectations of narrative structure? What techniques reflexively experiment with our expectations for an adaptation of a children's book? And here's a good one. What is repulsive here? What is grotesque? What makes it so grotesque? What do you have a visceral reaction to in this film? Is there anything here that's repetitive or even dull? And does that make the visceral parts worse? Maybe? Maybe not. But what kind of a reaction do you think that Svankmajer is after here? And finally, how can we think about this as a film about children, a film that is interrogating the childhood experience? What do we gain from thinking about it in that way? Okay, I hope you enjoy this film. Please, if you can, watch it with a buddy. Can't wait to hear what you think.